This is Alexander Jackson. I'll be taking you through the electrocardiogram and the respective cardiac events that occur in sequence with the electrocardiogram. So this is also considered the ECG, electrocardiogram, and then we're going to be looking at the cardiac events parallel to the ECG. So before we get into that, I do want to do a quick overview of the overall goal and mechanism of a heart, because that'll help us understand exactly why the ECG looks the way it does with the heart activity. So I want us to look originally at the heart's primary purpose, which is to pump a massive amount of blood through the circulatory pathway. Now that is only successful if, when we receive the blood here in the atria, whether through the right atrium, which will be bringing in deoxygenated blood from the body, or the left atrium, which is actually coming back from the lungs with oxygenated blood. And the goal here is to get all of this blood from the top down to the bottom as best we can before further pumping it either from the right ventricle out to the lungs or the left ventricle out to the body. So we're faced with a problem here because we've got a whole contractile unit of a heart, but we need to have two separate contractions, first of the atria, then the ventricles, to be physiologically effective and efficient. So it's really nifty because we're going to look at how the SA node, which is this guy right here, the sinoatrial node, will fire first in the right atria and then go through the interatrial pathway over to the left atria. And it's going to hit this AV node pretty much at the same time as well. But then this AV node will actually pause, allowing the atria to be excited and contract before being further sent down through the Purkinje fibers to contract the ventricles of the heart. Now this is so important because it allows a separation of contraction from the atria to the ventricles in a very rhythmic, systematic, contractile way, which makes this heart efficient and effective. And we're going to look at every step it takes from that very first action potential being reached in this SA node through the atria all the way through the ventricle and back when the heart is resting. And at this point in time, your heart has probably contracted about 180 times or so. So let's look through what happens in one of those pumping cycles. First thing I want to bring up is that there's a bit of a delayed response here. So let me draw your attention to this left graph. This is an action potential being reached. This is when the membrane depolarizes to about plus 30 to 40 millivolts, and that stimulates the muscles to contract. Now, if you notice, this is an electrical potential. It happens incredibly fast, but the muscle cells can't exactly contract at that supersonic speed. So there's a bit of a delayed response here. So if we look at the contraction, the contractile response, it occurs for about, 200 to 300 milliseconds, but it happens just after the potential is being reached and never ceases until about, 50 milliseconds after the refractory period ends. And that is really helpful to know when we're going to understand this ECG. Now, if you look at the ECG, every time besides, just a second, every time it goes up in this P wave and the Qrs complex or in the T wave, this is when there's electrical activity happening in the heart cells themselves. Whereas, when we look at these two flat lines here, that's when the muscle contractions are occurring. So that is directly aligned with this graph where action potential is being reached, boom, P wave, and then the contractile response happens about right after in this category. So it's really nifty when knowing, oh, hey, this is an electrical potential, and then this is the contraction, electrical potentials, contraction. Now the TP wave or segment is an exception to that rule. This is when both the atria and the ventricles are relaxing. So let's look through each and every step in the heart pump cycle. So let's look at an overview quick. And this is what I mentioned just before. Besides the TP segment, the changes in potential show that electrical activity, so potential being the y-axis. Whenever there's a change there, it means that there's electrical activity happening, like action potentials. And the flat lines are when the cardiac cells are actually contracting. So this PR segment and the ST segment, not the TP segment. So let's look at all of these different steps in the cardiac cycle now. Let me just extend this picture a little bit. So this is the P wave and the PR segment. And let's look at the P wave first. This is when the sinoatrial node is firing. So there's electrical activity happening in that right atria. It's going to go through the interatrial pathway to the left atrium and then go to the AV node. This allows the PR segment to happen, which is when the atria are actually contracting. So once again, the blip, electrical activity, the flat line, the contraction of the atria. Now this is the big thing I want to point out. Once the electrical potential reaches the AV node, there's a short delay. There's a really quick pause, and that's happening here in this PR segment. Once again, this is because we need the atria to fully have a 200 milliseconds to contract. Well, I guess it's only about 100 milliseconds to contract here, in order for it to be efficiently pumped out of the ventricles. So let's look at the next step. These atria just contracted. I need to enlarge my picture here. These atria just contracted. The transmission's being sent through the AV node down through the Purkinje fibers to the ventricular cells. That's where we're going to see this QRS complex. And this is probably the most famous, iconic part of an ECG. We're all familiar with that big jumping R peak and the S down. And this is when the ventricular tissue is being depolarized. This is, again, electrical activity. And during this same time, the atria are being repolarized. So if we look back at the action potential, the repolarization happens around here when it's going back down, reaching that resting potential of -90. So that's what that QRS is also showing when the atria are repolarizing. Now let's see what happens right after the ventricles depolarize. So they're going to be reaching action potentials. So after that QRS complex, we have the ST segment. And this is when the ventricles are fully contracting and emptying, pumping out. Once again, from the right ventricle, we're going through the pulmonary artery to the lungs to get some more oxygen, and the left ventricle is pumping out to the aorta, going to the systemic blood circulation to give oxygen to all the tissues of your body. And following this, once again, QRS complex, ventricular depolarization, these are the electrical potentials being reached, ST segment, ventricles contract. Let's look at the next step. After these ventricles contract, the T wave, once again, the movement on the recorded potential graph, this is going to be showing repolarization. Once again, repolarization, we're polarizing it again, and polarizing it means we're going negative towards the bottom of the graph. So this is going to be when the ventricle cells, all of their membrane potentials are going to be plummeting due to potassium efflux in the cells back to about a resting potential of -90 millivolts. Now once that occurs, that T wave, the ventricles are repolarizing. This TP segment is a time when the ventricles are relaxing and filling. So think about it. When we have those atria contracting, pushing all of this blood through into the ventricles, and the ventricles flood the body with all of this blood. Well, during that ventricular contraction, the blood is slowly trickling into these atria, allowing for pooling here. And these two, the tricuspid and the bicuspid, are going to be kind of closed there as the ventricles contract, allowing for really good, efficient pumping. But then as soon as this TP segment comes along, so right after that T wave, we're wanting those ventricles to fill up with blood, right? So that the atria can further push more blood and then make a really efficient pump out. So that's when these valves are going to briefly open and then allow some blood to trickle in, and then the atria are really going to push it out, and the ventricles are going to push it out once again. And thus the cycle is ended. So now we're back to that P wave, as we can see here, and that's when the SA node will fire again and start that whole segment over again. So here are the references from this slideshow. If you ever need to look over it again, that would be really beneficial to look at this entire recorded potential graph and the electrocardiogram just to understand what exactly is happening in each wave and each segment. just a reminder that the PR and the ST segments are when the atria and the ventricles are contracting respectively, and the TP segment is when they are just passively filling up. And just a quick note that one of the goals, kind of as a human, is to make your heart as efficient as possible. So that's why we like to say, hey, exercise and a healthy diet is so important so you don't get too much extra activity going here where you're wasting energy in your heart. And so if you look at an endurance athlete, their TP segment is probably incredibly long because they've trained their heart to pump massive amounts of blood at a lower heart rate. So that way, this QRS segment only comes about once every second or so, or maybe even less than a second, whereas the average person, it'll come, I guess, 70 beats per minute, so it'll be happening a little faster than once per second. So that's just an interesting physiological thing that occurs with endurance athletes. And again, another change would be that this R peak would probably be a little higher because there's going to be a really strong contraction in this ST segment yielding, and we need a strong signal for that, especially with hypertrophy, where more cells are going to be induced into an action potential. So there's just a little application clinically for you to ponder over. Here are 3 of the references I used for the slideshow. Feel free to look at them if you need these diagrams again, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks.